Well, good evening, and do what thou wilt. Thou art God. I'm here this evening to share with you some research on a topic I've been contemplating off and on for over 30 years. Now, the more recent effort to put these pieces together culminated just a few years ago on a Father's Day. In that case, it was also the anniversary of the death of Jack Parsons. And at that time, I finished putting together a piece that was to be given at the conference on Magick, Mysticism and Art in Barcelona, Catalonia. That was a couple of summers ago, and since then, the talk has grown into its current form through engagements in Dallas, Denver, and Los Angeles. Since then, I've also published several books on Thelemic magic and ritual. This is the obligatory flog. And most recently, I have become an author of fiction with my book Erodopharmacohymnia. And this is relevant because fiction is my topic here, in particular science fiction. And I want to start with this quote from Samuel Delany, a science fiction author. He points out that text comes from the Latin textus, meaning web, and he talks about the technology of modern printing. The web, which we think of as a sort of digital virtual space, the web is the physical ribbon of paper. In many presses, it takes upwards of an hour to thread from roller to roller through a huge machine, embedding rank rows of inked graphemes and rendering it into a text. So again, all these words that, as in the 21st century, we might think of in terms of digital environments and media, he's talking of in a very physical sense here: web, weave, net, matrix. And these are the points of entry into a textus, ordered from all language and language functions, and upon which the text itself is embedded. That's kind of, although we're talking about the physicality of printing, I know that sounds a little pomo and abstract. This is from a 1970s essay by Delany. But to focus in a little here, he goes on in this meditation to talk about the fact that science fiction emerges from technological innovations in printing. The same, he's talking about the paperback revolution starting in the 1960s. That's the context in which he was writing, but he also points out the earlier importance of the pulps. This was where the interplanetary adventures written by Edgar Rice Burroughs took place. The invention of science fiction per se as a marketable genre was a function of the pulps. And the pulps were possible because of this man, the German industrial chemist Karl Kellner, who became quite wealthy because he invented a process for manufacturing pulp paper. He was also, as we know, a student of yoga and the occult, and the spiritual father of Ordo Templi Orientis. So the organization of the Thelemic movement in OTO today is, in fact, a close cousin to the literary egregore of science fiction through this technological genealogy. Now, in this slide, I'm showing only a small selection of important works that demonstrate a continuing dialogue between science fiction and Thelemic occultism. In some cases, there's a clear sympathy without any evident case for influence, such as the sacramental neo-Gnosticism of Philip K. Dick, or James Morrow's Eternal Footman with its diseased holy guardian angels. But in this talk, I want to trace the objective influence of Thelema in the composition of Robert A. Heinlein's 1961 novel, Stranger in a Strange Land. Composed while he was living in Colorado Springs, not too far from where I'm sitting right now. I'll show how Heinlein encountered Thelemic ideas and mention some of the ways they were incorporated into this hugely successful book. Stranger in a Strange Land was enormously inspirational in the US counterculture. It contributed to various new religious groups and movements. And in fact, the religious ideals fostered by Valentine Michael Smith contributed to the OTO revival, so that the book can be seen as furnishing a sort of spiritual continuity during just the period during which OTO itself was in a dormant state. So hopefully you've already started to look at the quotes on this slide. The first is from Valentine Michael Smith. He is the stranger of Stranger in a Strange Land. He says, "I should have said that among Martians, there is only one religion, and it is not a faith. It's a certainty." Well, that ought to ring some bells, of course, because we can easily compare it with the Book of the Law, chapter 1, verse 58, "I give unimaginable joys on earth. Certainty, not faith, while in life upon death. Peace unutterable, rest, ecstasy, nor do I demand aught in sacrifice." And connected with these, I have a little quote from a founding adept of the OTO, Brother Franz Hartmann, who wrote, "There is perhaps very rarely a fable or work of fiction invented which is not based upon some fact, however disconnected such facts may be with the subject." Franz Hartmann, incidentally, also lived for a time in Colorado. That's the sort of synchronicity you expect among magicians. Now, in 1961, the Earth was invaded from Mars again. This invasion was very different than the one that had taken place in October of 1938 on the Columbia Broadcasting System, and its predecessor in 1897 in the Pulp Pearson's magazine. Now, although similarly fictional, the man from Mars in Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land was profoundly unlike the interplanetary Martian army of H.G. Wells' imperial imagination in War of the Worlds. Like Wells, and perhaps to an even greater extent, Heinlein, through his book, had an impact on the popular imagination that would shape society and culture far beyond the usual ambitions of mass entertainment media. Now, despite the book's overt marketing as science fiction, Heinlein insisted this story is Cabellesque satire on religion and sex. It is not science fiction by any stretch of the imagination. This remark, in correspondence to his literary agent, points down the trail to the esoteric roots of Stranger in a Strange Land, roots which help to account for its promiscuous flowering in countercultural groups and movements of the 1960s and beyond. The novel is set in an undated future. It takes place after the Third World War. There's a world federation of free states that includes the United States of America. Valentine Michael Smith is a man who was born on Mars and marooned there as an infant. He's been raised by distinctly non-humanoid Martians. And when the second manned expedition to Mars retrieves him 20 years later, Smith is helpless and uncomprehending of human culture. But he is also arguably heir to political title over the planet Mars, as well as a vast fortune in financial equities that he has inherited. As a result, he spends the opening parts of this book being rescued from his quote-unquote preposterous heritage. His rescuers are a hospital nurse, a muckraking journalist, and a venerable author. Once this is accomplished, Smith, who is known to his friends as Mike, becomes a private citizen with vast personal wealth. But meanwhile, it has become clear that his training by the Martians has endowed him not only with extraordinary control over his own organism, but with apparently supernatural abilities to manipulate time and space. The third part of the book is entitled His Eccentric Education. In this part, Smith is intrigued by a powerful young religious sect called the Church of the New Revelation. He sees it as a possible authority comparable to the old ones of Mars. But when he visits the Archangel Foster Tabernacle, Smith has an uncomfortably mixed reaction and ends up secretly disposing of their supreme bishop by pushing him out of corporeal existence along the fourth spatial dimension. Smith then goes on to experience sex, and he graduates to a more confident relationship to the world. He explores human society by working as a carnival magician, gambling in Las Vegas casinos, and viewing stripper performances. The book then continues with his scandalous career, in which Mike creates and supervises a religious body, the Church of All Worlds, because he wants to share the wisdom that he has received from the Martians with humanity. The Church teaches the Martian language and psychic disciplines, and its instruction is arranged in a graduated system of concentric circles, which culminate in an innermost nest whose members share in full all property and affections. In parallel to all these developments, the reader is given glimpses of a heavenly realm where angels and archangels monitor and guide corporeal humans. Those possessing official duties in this sphere can include Archangel Foster, the one-time founder of the Church of the New Revelation, and later also Supreme Bishop Digby, the fellow who Smith had disposed of in his visit to the church. Now, in the fifth and final part of the book, Smith's Church of All Worlds engenders hostility from the religious and political establishment, as well as its competition in the formidable Church of the New Revelation. So Smith rapidly completes his work of communicating what he knows of the Martian language and spiritual techniques to the core membership of the Church of All Worlds. He then accepts his happy destiny of being stoned to death by a mob, after which his physical remains are joyfully shared in a cannibalistic feast by his nestmates according to Martian custom. His post-mortem personality persists and consoles them, and then takes up his role as the Archangel Michael among those concerned with the third planet. So, that's the book at 1,000-foot view. Now, fiction was Heinlein's third career. He had previously retired from the U.S. Navy, and he worked as a political campaigner then, primarily with the socialist epic movement in California that was associated with Upton Sinclair. The early stages of Heinlein's writing spanned an initial period contributing to pulp magazines in the 1940s, chiefly John W. Campbell's astounding science fiction. And this period was followed by a set of very successful juvenile novels into and through the 1950s, such as Rocket Ship Galileo, Farmer in the Sky, and Starman Jones. Stranger in a Strange Land was in all respects a significant change of pace for him. He wrote to his agent regarding this book, "I first became aware of just how thoroughly I had boxed myself in when editors of my soi-disant adult books started asking me to trim them down to suit my juvenile market. At that time I had to comply, but now I would like to find out if I can write about adult matters for adults and get such writing published. I want to do my own stuff my own way." Heinlein was a rapid writer who prided himself on his professionalism. He was confidently able to turn out a novel in a month's time. But the manuscript for Stranger in a Strange Land gestated for about 11 years, starting with a brainstorming session in late 1948 with his wife Virginia, in which she proposed something like the Mowgli story from Kipling's Jungle Book, where an infant would be raised by aliens and first introduced to human society as a young adult. Heinlein liked the idea and quickly produced a treatment for it running to more than a dozen pages, which he then shelved so that he could address more pressing writing obligations. Still, many of the book's key concepts were formulated in this 1948-49 Genesis, including the idea that the man from Mars could become a messiah, either tragically unsuccessful or dramatically successful. During the following decade, Heinlein attempted to bring this writing project to fruition. He made significant efforts in 1952 and 1953. In 1955, he produced about 54,000 words, ultimately declaring it aborted after 2 months of continuous effort. He finally struck fire in the opening months of 1960, generating an 800-page manuscript over a period of 63 days, working 12 to 14 hours a day, and finishing on March 21st. Now, the working title of the book was never crucial to Heinlein. He called it The Man from Mars, but once the book was sold to G.P. Putnam's Sons, there were still many candidates for the name of what Heinlein had come to call My Sex and Jesus book. These included The Heretic, The Sound of His Wings, A Sparrow Falls, Of Good and Evil, All Who Grok, The Grokking Work, and The Fallen Caryatid. The final title, Stranger in a Strange Land, is from the Bible, Exodus chapter 2, verse 22. It was proposed by Howard Cady, the book's editor at Putnam's. There was significant friction with the publisher over the content and length of the manuscript. Ultimately, Heinlein was able to keep all of the controversial content, miracles, sex, and religion, but he cut as much as 25% of the total length in polishing the manuscript and working with his editor. Now, the commercial reception of the book was at first lukewarm. There were unfavorable reviews in the library press and the New York Times, and sales were anemic. But the book proved to be a sleeper, with booming sales following the Avon paperback release, and more than 66 paperback printings, keeping it continuously in print until its copyright renewal by Virginia Heinlein in 1991. The one item of Martian vocabulary specified in the novel, the verb grok, has found a place in nearly all major dictionaries of the English language. The book was the first avowed science fiction title to appear on the bestseller list of the New York Times Book Review. The readership of Stranger generated an unprecedented deluge of mail to the author, much of it exceeding the usual topical scope of fan mail. And the success of the book, according to critic Scott McFarlane, hinged on the way in which it fortuitously, quote, tapped into an emerging new zeitgeist where rebellion against 50s conformity together with psychedelics, the pill, and rock music created the Dionysian fervor. Now, Heinlein scholar William Patterson was a little more observant of the actual chronology, and he wrote, by 1968, the neologism grok had so penetrated pop culture that it was being used in advertising by a Canadian telephone company, and the water sharing ritual and jargon was routinely and widely used in the emerging counterculture. To some extent, the counterculture constructed itself around Stranger as a seed crystal. Stranger in a Strange Land had become one of the most influential books in American history, comparable in its impact to Uncle Tom's Cabin or The Jungle. Now, this book won the 1962 Hugo Award for Best Novel, awarded by the World Science Fiction Society. As I mentioned earlier, though, Heinlein considered Stranger in a Strange Land to be something altogether different from science fiction, something he characterized as a Cabellesque satire on religion and sex. By Cabellesque, he was referencing the author James Branch Cabell, whose work Heinlein had begun reading at the prompting of his friend Cal Laning while they were completing a final term at the U.S. Naval Academy in 1929. Like the vast majority of Cabell's readers, Heinlein started with the book Jurgen, A Comedy of Justice. This is Cabell's most famous novel, and it features the travels of the eponymous pawnbroker Jurgen as he transacts amorous intrigues with a series of women from myth and fable. Now, Stranger in a Strange Land does not actually much resemble the picaresque medieval fantasy of Jurgen. Now, both do include satire kicking against the customary morality of their contemporaries, and the Martian water-sharing ceremony may contain a faint echo of Jurgen's refrain of promiscuity, "I am willing to taste any drink once." But there is something more that powerfully links these two works. Jurgen was first published in 1919, and it enjoyed a great deal of fame because of the prompt effort to suppress it, undertaken by Anthony Comstock's New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, then headed by John H. Sumner, who brought an obscenity case against the book. After 2 years of highly publicized trial, the court found in favor of the defendants, Cabell and his publisher, Robert M. McBride and Company. During the course of the trial, Cabell wrote to his friend and editor, Guy Holt, "I have solved the problem of the lance ceremony, which is taken from the Equinox, Volume 3, pages 250 to 258. You have this volume, I know. It is also perhaps of importance that these ceremonies were originally printed in a 15-cent magazine, The International, which was never arranged for lewdness, since 15 cents is considerably less than $1.79. Now, the lance ceremony to which Cabell was referring is chapter 22 of Jurgen, As to a Veil They Broke, which takes place in the land of Cockaigne, where there is no law save that do that which seems good to you. The greater part of the chapter is a sentence-for-sentence paraphrase of the first passages of the liturgy of Aleister Crowley's Gnostic Mass through the ceremony of the opening of the veil. Cabell did have the original text, as it had been sent to him by Crowley himself. Crowley first became aware of Cabell when the Virginian author's Beyond Life was sent to him, evidently by H.L. Mencken. Crowley wrote a warm review, and he sent this to Cabell before publication, along with a copy of the All Drama Number 3 of Volume 12 of the International, which included the first publication of the Gnostic Mass. The Gnostic Mass, of course, has become the central liturgy for OTO. After receiving an encouraging reply from Cabell, Crowley's review of Beyond Life was then published in the same number of the Equinox, where he again published the Gnostic Mass. This exchange inaugurated an extensive correspondence. In his confessions, Crowley wrote, "I have been accused of exaggerated enthusiasm for Cabell," which is small wonder, considering that Crowley called Cabell at once the most ambitious and the best worth study of living authors, as well as undoubtedly the greatest philosopher as well as magician that has ever arisen in America. So, the Master Therian and Prophet of Thelema believed that a man of Cabell's sensibility could be won over to champion the new eon, and he sent Cabell a copy of the Book of the Law. He wrote, "I am really eager that you should see my point of view and eventually wake up the world to that superb destiny which lies beneath the superficial sorrow and futility which form the tragedy of your epic." Cabell was also the addressee of the commentary composed in Cefalù in 1923 and eventually published as a memorandum regarding the Book of the Law, in which Crowley wrote to Cabell, "The world is waiting for you to utter the wizard word Thelema." Still hopeful, Crowley addressed a 1942 letter to Cabell with the salutation, "Cher maître." Now, Heinlein's early reading of Cabell was also enthusiastic. William Patterson has made an impressive case that Cabell's work inspired many of Heinlein's ambitions as an author, especially the ones fulfilled in his later World as Myth novels. The Church of All Worlds initiation pageant ceremony in Chapter 31 of Stranger in a Strange Land exhibits a parallel in content to As to a Veil They Broke. There's a sort of liturgical set piece in the second arc of the novel. But it is unlikely that Heinlein was able to recognize the Thelemic religious ceremony in Chapter 22 of Jürgen when he first read it in 1929. On the other hand, it is certain that he could when he was writing Stranger, because by that time he had already attended an actual Gnostic Mass. In the early 1940s, there was a significant and fruitful intersection between Thelemic occultism and the community of science fiction readers and writers. The Los Angeles Science Fiction Society, or LASFS, had grown out of the local chapter number 4 of Pulp publisher Hugo Gernsback's Science Fiction League. In this early period, they met regularly at Clifton's Cafeteria, a multi-level eatery with an indoor waterfall and decorations simulating a redwood forest. Accomplished writers like Jack Williamson and aspiring ones like Ray Bradbury were common attendees, as were fans such as Jack Parsons. As a pioneering rocket engineer, Parsons sometimes spoke to the group, where he was well received. The autodidact Parsons was also then increasingly active in Thelemic occultism, having attended his first Gnostic Mass at the Winona Boulevard Church of Thelema in early 1939, and joining both OTO and AA in 1941. The LASFS is where Jack Parsons first met Grady McMurtry, who was then a student at Pasadena City College, and the two of them bonded as poets. Parsons introduced McMurtry to OTO and loaned the younger man the dues and fees for his first initiation into the order. When Robert Heinlein met Jack Parsons at an LASFS meeting, both men were in their 30s, with Parsons about 7 years Heinlein's junior. Their shared interests in rocketry and science fiction led Heinlein to invite Parsons to the Manana Literary Society, a writers' cabal hosted by the Heinleins in their home. Regular attendees there included Cleve Cartmill and Jack Williamson, both of whom Parsons had already introduced to OTO as guests at a Winona Boulevard Gnostic Mass. Heinlein himself attended at least one Gnostic Mass, and he retained in his papers both the copy of the Book of the Law and the congregational missal that he had received there. At this time, Heinlein was married to his second wife, Leslin, who was a practicing occultist of her own stripe. The couple were not sexually exclusive, and the shifting personal relationships of the scene among the California Thelemites of the day would not have been jarring for Heinlein. Heinlein was also the matchmaker for the ill-fated friendship between Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard. As a fellow science fiction writer, Heinlein had known Hubbard for many years and suggested that he would benefit from making Parsons' acquaintance. So it was Heinlein's promptings that led Hubbard to seek out Parsons in 1945 and to take up residence in the 1003 Orange Grove mansion in Pasadena that had become the home of Agape Lodge OTO, and where Parsons was the landlord and acting lodge master. Heinlein also introduced Parsons to the atomic engineer Robert Cornog, whom Heinlein had met at a nudist colony in Colorado years earlier. Like Hubbard, Cornog became a resident at the mansion that many called the parsonage. Meanwhile, Parsons had continued his scientific accomplishments, inventing solid fuel for jet-assisted takeoff, an invention by which he and the other members of the Galsit group at Caltech had introduced rocketry to the U.S. military. They founded Aerojet and established the Jet Propulsion Laboratories. In 1946, in connection with the now notorious Babylon working on which Parsons collaborated with Hubbard, he tendered his resignation from OTO. During this period, his relations with Hubbard caused Parsons serious financial and emotional distress, and he also sold the parsonage property. It was around this time that he also introduced his new partner, Marjorie Cameron, to Heinlein. Aleister Crowley died in 1947, with headship of OTO passing to Carl Germer in New York. In the same year, Robert Cornog lost his security clearance following allegations of involvement with communism. Parsons had cause to worry over his own past history of interest in communism, although he had not joined the party. The FBI had in fact been keeping a file on Parsons, largely detailing his involvement with the love cult known as the Church of Thelema, as they documented it, and they had renewed their interest in him when he began work on the Navajo missile program. He was blacklisted from defense contracting and went on to work a series of unglamorous jobs, while Cameron briefly left him to live in an artist's colony in Mexico. In 1948, Parsons swore the oath of the abyss with his AA superior and OTO lodge master predecessor, Wilfred Talbot Smith, as a witness, and he took the name Beleriand Armilus El Dajjal and the title Antichrist. After a period of intense ritual contemplation and writing, both autobiographical and polemical, Parsons recovered his social and professional bearings, including the renewal of his security clearance. The following year, he met the fantasy writer and occultist L. Sprague de Camp at a cocktail party hosted by Heinlein and his third wife, Virginia. The newly minted Antichrist struck de Camp as, quote, big, florid-looking youngish man with the indefinable aura of inherited wealth, unquote. When Parsons died in the explosion that consumed his residence and workshop on June 17, 1952, de Camp sent a postcard to Heinlein summarizing a newspaper article on the event and remarking that it appeared to him to be murder. There is no reason to think that Heinlein would imagine OTO or Thelema surviving the deaths of Crowley and Parsons. But he did write about a church of all worlds that showed every sign of being able to continue after the death of Valentine Michael Smith, with Mike's own personal presence persisting after death. Heinlein's letters supply some indirect hints about the possible relationship between Stranger in a Strange Land and his prior exposure to Thelema, mostly through Jack Parsons. In particular, he offers these remarks about his authorial process. I work slowly on a novel for the first few chapters only. As soon as I can hear the characters talk, it then becomes a race to see whether I put down their actions fast enough not to miss any of them. My notion of a story is an interesting situation in which a human being has to cope with a problem, does so, and thereby changes his personality, character, or evaluations in some measure, because the coping has forced him to revise his thinking. How he copes with it, I can't plot in advance, because that depends on his character, and I don't know what his character is until I get acquainted with him. When I can hear the character talk, then I'm all right. He works out his own salvation. We may conclude, then, that the struggle with the Man from Mars manuscript throughout the 1950s consisted of a period when Heinlein could not yet hear the character talk. This insight prompts certain questions. Which character did he need to hear? What allowed him to hear the character? In the account given by Heinlein scholar Patterson, the compositional logjam was broken when the viewpoint character was shifted away from the journalist Ben Caxton, taking the focus instead to a character whom the book introduces as Jubal Harshaw, LLB, MD, SCD, bon vivant, gourmet, sybarite, popular author extraordinary, and neo-pessimist philosopher. Heinlein objected to those who took Jubal for a transparent author's mouthpiece, writing, "Some critics say that my stories always contain a wise and crusty old man who is my own concept of myself. Not true. They are all different, and they are not self-portraits. They are many men who did indeed live and who were my mentors, and now they are all gone to whatever Valhalla there may be for such men." Patterson believed that Harshaw was a synthesis of Arthur George Sarge Smith, E. Doc Smith, and Hermann Deutsch, and these men may each have contributed details to the character, but several sets of cues in the text of Stranger in a Strange Land point to Aleister Crowley as Heinlein's model. Now keep in mind that the Aleister Crowley in question is not the wickedest man in the world as he was represented in the Yellow Press, but instead the one of Jack Parsons' reverent regard, the original Thelemite of the new eon, the old sage who has adventured widely and written countless books and embodies what Ben Caxton in Stranger calls freedom of self and utter personal responsibility for self. Crowley, per Parsons, then supplies the voice of Jubal Harshaw, and Parsons himself the voice of the mature Valentine Michael Smith. When Jubal first appears in the novel, he is presiding over a secluded household of various non-consanguineal adults. He characterizes this as Freedom Hall, my dear. Everyone does as he pleases. Then if he does something I don't like, I kick him the hell out. The property is a retreat where there are no clocks, just as in Rabelais' Abbey of Thelema. The cat on the premises is named Friedrich Nietzsche. When Jubal remarks the halal dietary code of the linguist from the Martian expedition, he says, "Eat what you will, my brother." Now, a poem by Rudyard Kipling had paired the name Jubal with the Masonic figure of Tubal-Cain. Heinlein was not himself a Freemason, but he would have been aware of the Masonic infrastructure of OTO, and he had already written a story which featured a Masonic underground resisting theocratic tyranny in 1940, entitled If This Goes On. The story was set, not set, it was written in 1940, set centuries in the future. Valentine Michael Smith's Church of All Worlds is, in turn, organized, quote, in 9 circles like lodge degrees, unquote. Likewise, the Man from Mars addresses women as his brothers, and this usage is adopted in his church, which may allude to the same custom in some forms of co-masonry, possibly even including early OTO groups. In her preface to the 1991 edition of Stranger in a Strange Land, Virginia Heinlein says the name Jubal means father of all. The Hebrew meaning of the name Jubal is in fact obscure, but it first appears in Genesis chapter 4, verse 21. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the ancestor of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. The book construes Jubal as Valentine Michael Smith's spiritual father, who orients him to humanity. and Mike then makes him the patron saint of the church. Mike also ornaments the inner nest of the church with a life-size hologram of Jubal's head. Crowley's name Baphomet, as Grand Master of OTO, refers to the supposed idol of the Templars, which was allegedly worshipped in the form of a head. Now, this idea of idolatry is also perpetuated in the novel with a recurrent motif centered on Jubal's interest in art sculpture. In particular, he is an aficionado of the work of Auguste Rodin. His favorites are She Who Used to Be the Beautiful Holmiere and The Caryatid Fallen Under Her Stone. As it happens, these two are among the first 4 works represented in Crowley's Rodin in Rhyme, a set of 40 poems interpreting individual sculptures by Rodin. Crowley wrote these in the context of his personal acquaintance with and admiration for the sculptor. Jubal also points to Edvard Ericsson's Little Mermaid as a metaphor for Mike in his position with one foot in the Martian world and one in the human. Similarly, The Fallen Caryatid, which was considered as a title for the entire Sex and Jesus book, can be seen as an allegory of the tragic dimension of Mike's messianic career. A painting of the Rodin Caryatid sculpture was the dust jacket art for the first hardcover edition of Stranger. Crowley is mentioned explicitly when Mike undertakes his comparative study of religious scripture, where a diverse list of 12 holy books is followed by sacred writings of a dozen other religions, major and minor, even such oddities as Crowley's Book of the Law. When Jubal refers to Mike as a, quote, God-struck boy leading a sex cult in an upholstered attic, it is easy to infer a subtext referencing the Gnostic masses that Parsons and likely Heinlein himself attended in the attic temple of the Church of Thelema on Winona Boulevard. Once Mike gets his Church of All Worlds up and running, he is vilified repeatedly as an antichrist, the title assumed by Parsons before his last in-person encounters with Heinlein. The name Valentine, of course, alludes to the Gnostic heresiarch Valentinus, who figures as a saint in the Gnostic Mass, and the career arc of Valentine Michael Smith, the otherworldly young man who aspires to lead a new religion and dies in the prime of life, is that of Jack Parsons as much as it is Jesus of Nazareth. There are other characters that seem to point by association to Aleister Crowley, even in ways that Heinlein himself could hardly have known. Take the astrologer Becky Alexandra Vesant, who figures in the story as a minor but important figure. While her name is a bit of a red herring, suggesting the theosophist Annie Besant, this old friend of Jubal's is manifestly based on the historical person of Evangeline Adams, whose books on astrology, Your Place in the Sun and Your Place in the Stars, were ghostwritten by Crowley. Note that the influence of Crowley and Parsons in this book does not have to have been conscious on Heinlein's part. It's only necessary that the voices of these two dead men came to guide the composition of the novel in Colorado Springs in 1960 from whatever Valhalla of Heinlein's memory. Heinlein also, it is, I think, still fair to credit some conscious authorial design. Not only is there this great wealth of detailed allusion, of which I've barely begun to scratch the surface, and won't exhaust in the course of this talk, but Heinlein also dedicated the book to Robert Cornog, someone who had lived at the parsonage. And then we have this that Heinlein wrote in a letter to neo-pagan organizer Tim Zell. Stranger is an invitation to think, not to believe. Certainly, do as thou wilt is the whole of the law, is correct when looked at properly. In fact, it is a law of nature, not an injunction nor a permission. But it is necessary to remember that it applies to everyone, including lynch mobs. The universe is what it is, and it never forgives mistakes, not even ignorant ones. Now, the addressee of that letter, Zell, was one of many readers who were inspired by the novel in their search for new forms of community and freedom from the strictures of American mass society. Barely a year after the publication of Stranger, Zell had joined Lance Christie and a small group of friends at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, in establishing an ad hoc water brotherhood called Atl. The name of the group was supposedly an Aztec word for water, but it also alluded to the interest of some of the original members in the elite withdrawal from a doomed society described in Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. The group did not maintain a religious doctrine or advance metaphysical ideas, but within it, Zell began liturgical experiments under the moniker of the Church of All Worlds. While Atlans of this original fellowship apparently persisted in maintaining their own small nest-type societies, Zell's church began to develop independence and publicity beginning in 1967. Zell also adopted a great deal of practice and doctrine from the nature worship group Feraferia. Zell's church, then centered in St. Louis, Missouri, began to style itself as pagan, a term that Zell had picked up from literature published by another stranger-influenced group the previous year. That other group was called Charista. Originally, it was founded by John Prestmont in New York in the 1950s, and Charista emphasized intentional community with utopian ideals. Carrie Thornley, under the pen name Young Omar, called Charista, quote, akin to the so-called pagan religions of the pre-Christian West, unquote, in an essay that he wrote entitled Charista's Erotic Ethic and Etc. And Thornley's interest in science fiction and his association with Charista at that time has led a number of readers to suppose that he is the correspondent to whom Heinlein referred when writing his agent in 1966, I recently learned that Stranger was considered the New Testament and compulsory reading of a far-out cult called Charista. Christ! I don't know exactly what Charista is, but its LA chapter offered me $100 to speak. I turned them down. Curiously, at about this same time, OTO initiate Grady McMurtry was working on a different Charista publication to which he contributed the essay Millennial Utopians, Nostalgia for Eden and the Forest Primeval. McMurtry's essay is a brief value statement relating Charistan ambitions to literary and social traditions of communalism, but McMurtry seems to have parted ways with Charista shortly thereafter without having been deeply involved. In 1968, Zell's Church of All Worlds launched their newsletter Green Egg, which would grow to serve as a key forum networking various neo-pagan groups in the United States. Zell began a correspondence with Heinlein in 1971, which endured for many years. Although Heinlein did not join Zell's church, he accepted a Green Egg subscription and expressed a certain amount of sympathy for Zell's efforts. In an early letter to Zell, he wrote, I have never expressed antagonism or hostility to nests or water brotherhoods. On the contrary, a number of nests have indeed gotten into contact with me. I have treated them with politeness. I have standing invitations to visit them. I think I am on good terms with every such organization which has taken the trouble to get into touch with me. Zell's vision of CAW, or the Church of All Worlds, shifted during the following decade, along with the culture of the church, to increasingly emphasize eco-spirituality, the idea of the planet as a divine intelligence, and the worship of the goddess. Green Egg ceased publication in 1976, and CAW dropped its use of the nine-circle hierarchy that it had formerly modeled on Valentine Michael Smith's church. Meanwhile, during the 1970s, OTO was undergoing revival under the leadership of Grady McMurtry. Very near the end of McMurtry's life in 1985, Heinlein sent him a copy of his new novel with the Cabell-styled title, Job, A Comedy of Justice. Hymenius Beta, who succeeded McMurtry as head of OTO, has reportedly mentioned that he first encountered an explicit reference to Crowley in the pages of Stranger in a Strange Land. Certainly, a stranger-fueled counterculture with its interest in the occult and openness to social experiment had contributed to favorable conditions for the regeneration of OTO. Heinlein, after a lifetime filled with episodes of ill health, died himself on May 8, 1988, at the age of 80. His widow, Virginia Heinlein, used an allowance of the 1976 U.S. copyright law for literary estate to modify existing contracts following the author's death. She and Heinlein's final literary agent, Eleanor Wood, proposed to the publisher that the considerably longer original version of Stranger in a Strange Land, still extant in archived manuscript, should be published as the current and future edition. In her foreword, she implied that the first edition had been expurgated with the removal of passages that were offensive to public taste in 1961. Heinlein's estate and publisher were thus able to sell his most popular book for a second time to many thousands of people who already owned a copy. But the cuts made to the original manuscript for first publication were done for length, not content. They were not editor's cuts, but laborious author's cuts at the publisher's request, which also added some material, although the net effect was to dramatically shorten the book. There is no additional value in the restored text. All references in this talk are to the sadly scarce hardcover 1961 first edition, the text of which had such significant cultural impact in its many paperback reprints. Since 1991, only the inferior longer edit has been reliably in print. The book's literary reputation has suffered as a result. If you go read any number of reviews written in the last 30 years, what you will find is people disappointed at a book that is meandering and slow-paced, which is a description that only applies to the unedited text. It does not the book that people were reading in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. After various changes for CAW and its leaders, Green Egg was revived in the year of Heinlein's death, with Zell as publisher and Diane Darling as editor. 4 years later, they saw into print a lengthy essay by Adam Rostocker in serial form over 3 issues of the magazine. Rostocker was both a CAW member and an OTO initiate, and his Whence Came the Stranger essay was concerned to make Thelema accessible and appealing to late 20th century neo-pagans. In an editorial note, Darling and Zell called this piece one of the most significant articles we have ever published. Rostocker construed Stranger in a Strange Land as a piece of allegorical Thelemic evangelism, and he identified other Thelemic signals beyond the ones I've mentioned so far, both in the novel and in Heinlein's other writings. In light of Heinlein's well-defended personal privacy, and before the considerable biographical researches that have since been published about him, Rostocker indulged in highly speculative claims about Heinlein's ambitions to communicate Thelema as such and as part of a larger occult tradition. Now, rather than identifying Valentine Michael Smith with Parsons, as I've done here, Rostocker suggested that the man from Mars was intended to be the child of thy bowels from the Book of the Law, chapter 1, verse 57, and to fulfill various oracles in the Book of Babylon that Parsons had received through his Babylon working. Rostocker explained Jubal Harshaw as I was and as a personification of the Book of the Law. He proposed that Ben Caxton's name was derived from Caxton Hall, where Crowley's rites of Eleusis had been performed, and that the character of Ben was intended to demonstrate the path of Thelemic initiation through the 3 true grades of man of earth, lover, and hermit. Regardless of the validity of any of Rostocker's particular assertions, their cumulative effect tends to persuade the reader that there was some sort of connection between Heinlein's popular fable and Parsons' esoteric religion. Adam Rostocker was later murdered in his home under unexplained circumstances at age 37, the same age at which Jack Parsons died. During his education by Jubal, Mike found himself wondering if the old ones knew about fiction. The incredible idea that there might be something as strange to the old ones as it was to himself was so much more revolutionary than the weird concept of fiction that he put it aside to cool, saved it for meditation. Valentine Michael Smith's age at the time of his death is not indicated in the novel, but he has probably reached his 4th decade like any properly typical sacrificial savior. Jubal is initially racked with grief for his foster son. He thinks bitterly that Mike could have given them something big, like stereo or bingo, but he gave them the truth. And who is interested in truth? We may still need time in order to grok the true extent to which Heinlein's Man from Mars carried the gnosis of Thelema. Waiting is. Love is the law, love under will.
Wow, that was fantastic. And thank you, brother. We're going to open up the chat for questions. If you have a question that can be typed in for the chat, let's get you to go ahead and type it in there. If somebody has something that's just like way too long or unwieldy, Brother Dionysius, are you okay if they just turn on the mic, or would you prefer that they keep it to the chat?
If people could use chat to ask for the mic, that would help. I'm gonna go ahead and open a chat window so I can just see the.
Okay.
See if there's questions coming in. So we have Frater Prolixus remarks that he actually liked the longer version better, but he had the benefit of having read the shorter version first. Scientific evidence, based on my scouring the internet for reviews posted, suggests that people who approach the book through the longer version first like it a lot less. And I have read both, and I can totally attest to what the when I was working on this, I felt it was my duty to read both versions, and by the time I got to the end of the longer version, I felt like I was supposed to do it. I did it, but it was kind of a waste of time because I got absolutely nothing. I mean, anything that I noticed in there that was like something that was worth remarking, it was in the shorter version anyway. So that's just a tip to people. If you haven't read the book, you're better off buying a cheap used copy of the short version. And even if it takes you a little time to hunt one down, they're out there. It went through 70 printings.
Well, I have a maybe not so much a question, but an observation that really jumped out at me that maybe you have any sort of insight on. But in chapter 11, one line that really jumped out was where he's discussing about the difference between Martians and humans. Very end of the chapter, he writes, Martian nymphs were female. All adults were male. Chapter 3, the oyster of the Book of Lies. The brothers of AA are women. The aspirants to AA are men. The entire chapter dealing with absorption, the mini bliss, and themes such as that. Do you think there might have been any kind of...
To be honest, I think what Heinlein was doing there was he was deliberately setting up a very non-human sort of sexual differentiation in the Martian species, so that because what happens, even though Mike constructs his church around around the Martian language and around what he has learned by being this, foot in both worlds kind of person, the final arc of the book is really concerned with the way in which Mike's Martian perspective reveals to him things that are peculiar and valuable about humanity that humans don't see because they're soaking in it, right? I mean, he's coming at humanity as a Martian, and he's like, oh my God, humans, they have this different kind of sexual thing that Martians totally don't have, and it's really powerful, and it has all these possibilities that they aren't even scratching the surface of. And so I think that I really don't think that was an allusion to, Crowley's sort of sex and gender symbolism, as in that's represented in that Book of Lies chapter and elsewhere. I think it was a science fictional setup on Heinlein's part to drive that message later in the book, to make the Martians more alien.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anyone else that has any questions or observations or thoughts they'd like to share?
If I've got another funny note about edition history. This came up in the Q&A after I gave this talk in Dallas. There's a very peculiar feature of Stranger in a Strange Land, that the hardcover first edition is a book club edition. And usually, I mean, especially with science fiction books, like, book club editions are easy to find. They're usually published on crappier paper. They're not valuable at all. They're disposable. But the weird circumstances of the publishing of Stranger meant that the book club edition was supposed to be released simultaneously with the regular first retail release, and the retail release got held up, and so the book club edition went out first. So it's a strange feature that the true first edition of Stranger in a Strange Land is a book club edition. So if you see that old one with the green caryatid dust jacket, and you open it up and it says 1961 book club edition, it's like, that's actually a first edition.
There are questions, but you need to scroll down.
Oh, I'm not scrolling. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Let's see. Do I think Heinlein could have been exposed to Enochian magic? I totally think he was likely to have been exposed to it, in as much as Jack was really into it. And the idea of Enochian magic as the different linguistic perspective makes magic possible. I think that yes, Enochian could have been a touchstone for Heinlein there, but I think it also could just as well have been Kabbalistic exegesis. The fact that if Martian language is the organizing basis for the Church of All Worlds, right? They have these 9 circles, and the way that they bring people through and graduate them through is by teaching them Martian language. And in some respects, this is useful because it helps them appreciate the Martian philosophical concepts. But in many ways, it's just arbitrary. It's just something for them to work on so that they can develop discipline and be in a community with a shared goal. And so, and I think you see, if you look at OTO as at the actual OTO of Parsons and Friends as being the model for that, what was actually happening in that OTO in that way was a lot of Kabbalistic exegesis, the magical use of various languages, not just Enochian, but Hebrew and Greek and so forth. And I think that would stand out to an observer, and that it was picked up and adopted that way by Heinlein. Have I thought about the fact that it is sexist? And the remark here is Crowley is less sexist. Yes, it is a notoriously sexist book. Obviously literary standards have changed a little bit. It's interesting to read it against Jürgen in terms of what is sexist. And it's, Jubal is very, the sexism per se is almost all coming from, well, there's 2 different kinds of sexism. I'm sorry, in the book. I think the 2 sexist models in the book are Ben Caxton, who is the journalist character, and he represents an intelligent but in many ways unsophisticated person certainly a very unspiritual, unrealized person, right? He's a sort of foil for the spiritual agenda of the book, although he makes progress by the end. And so his sexism, especially in his relationship with Jill, and the way that gets difficult for him, is there, I think, as an object lesson, actually. And Jubal's sexism is a piece of his sort of patriarchal tude, that helps identify him as an older man with more, with experience and a little bit of what's the word I'm fishing for here? That it makes him a little bit. It's a sardonic skepticism. It's sort of a jaded attitude about gender relations. But he too has this sort of rehabilitation at the end of the book. So I think, and I know, again, this is a feature of the longer version of the book, is that a lot of people, they get halfway through the book and they're like, I can't stand all this sexist crap. But in the shorter book, you see more of a character arc in terms of how the characters express it. Sail Beyond the Sunset and Lazarus Long material with OTO affinities. Sure. I mean, Heinlein wrote a book called Number the Beast. He wrote, I think Thelema was important to Heinlein. I think he was something of a crypto-Thelemite, but I think he was into it in his own way. He wasn't evangelizing for OTO or anything like that. I mean, it was a source of ideas for him, and he enjoyed dribbling out little teases and trails, and Patterson, he talks about how the World as Myth books are more faithful to the Cabellesque inspiration of Heinlein, and I think they also have more expressions of his esoteric and occult ideas to the extent that he embraced them. One thing that happened with Heinlein's later novels is he stopped having an editor. I mean, he had a nominal editor. He had an editor who was his publisher's business representative and who he would talk to about his progress and submit his work through and so on. But the level of editorial control that Putnam's exercised over him in his early career was totally gone. I mean, he was a made man. All they had to do was bring out a new book with Heinlein's name on the cover, and they knew it was going to sell. So they didn't. There wasn't like a lot of pushing and pulling in terms of the shapes of manuscripts or the contents of books. So those later World as Myth books are, Heinlein is much more unfettered in terms of where he takes those. The interesting question about whether Heinlein influenced Le Guin in The Left Hand of Darkness, published in 1969, obviously is a much more culturally sophisticated treatment of gender, and do we blame that solely on her father's work as an anthropologist? It had to be a factor. Le Guin was a very conscious feminist as well, and I don't think she became a conscious feminist because of Reading Stranger in a Strange Land. So I think she was almost certainly, she knew about Stranger. She had almost certainly read Stranger, and I think that the reception of Stranger, the enthusiastic reception of Stranger by science fiction readers, was likely to have been evidence for her that she could attempt the sort of things that she did in The Left Hand of Darkness, that would have, and that they were marketable to a science fiction readership in a way that they almost certainly weren't to mainstream readers in 1969. Lazarus Long is a lot like Jubal. Yes, well, maybe. Heinlein says they're not. They're different guys. Lazarus Long seems like a more transparent author's mouthpiece to me than Jubal does, but he is a if we believe Heinlein, there's some model for long. I'm sure Patterson has a theory about who it is. I totally recommend Patterson's scholarship. Unfortunately, he died a few years ago. I never got to correspond with him directly on this work when I was finally bringing it to term. But he has written a good amount about. He doesn't really understand magic. I mean, his footnotes about Thelema and the Book of the Law in his biography of Heinlein are a wreck. He can't even seem to muster direct quotes. But as far as his handling of the source material from Heinlein, he's got just incredible amounts of detail and scope. And did Grady's affiliation begin with OTO affiliation begin with interest in science fiction? The answer is yes. Yes, Grady met Jack in the science fiction club in LA, and Jack introduced Grady to OTO. Grady's ambitions were primarily at that time primarily literary rather than spiritual, and Jack and Grady hit it off as poets, and a lot of Jack's devotion to Crowley and Thelema was through Crowley's poetry, and before very long he was introducing Grady to OTO. There's a question here about my remark about a possible allusion of the water sharing ritual in Stranger. I suggested that it might in part be referencing there's a refrain in Jurgen. Jurgen is going to all these different ladies and carrying on amours, and in each case there is a point where he sort of resigns himself to the fatality of the encounter, and he says, "I'm willing to taste any drink once." That I think there's a little bit of illusion going on there with the water sharing ritual. Of course, there's we might consider Thelemic liturgical influences as well, but I don't think I want to go into any detail on that.